Standing at the window of his once magnificent office, Ethan watched as his empire crumbled. Once a titan of industry, the company he had built from the ground up was now reduced to chaos, its future uncertain. Reports flooded in about lost contracts, betrayed clients, and the ever-deteriorating public trust. In the heart of it all was Sophia, his partner, his equal, now vanished, leaving only whispers in her wake. Something had shifted. This was no accident. She was no longer in control. And as Ethan's fingers hovered over the keys, a spark of determination ignited. It was time to take back what was his. Years ago, Ethan had trusted Sophia with everything: his ideas, his dreams, his vision. Together they had built an empire, rising to the top with their combined genius. They were invincible. But that trust had been shattered when Sophia betrayed him, taking full control of the company and locking him out of the very systems they had created. At first it seemed like a simple business decision, a necessary move to keep the company afloat. But Ethan soon realized it was much more personal. She had erased him from their legacy, deleting his access, rewriting history, and locking him out of his own creation. The pain of betrayal cut deeper than he could have ever imagined. She hadn't just stolen the company. She had stolen his identity. The company he had sacrificed everything for was now hers, and his efforts had been reduced to nothing more than a distant memory. As Sophia's power grew, so did the injustice. Ethan had been silenced, erased, and trapped in a world of his own making, his every move watched and controlled by the very system they had built together. Ethan spent months watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His mind, once filled with doubt, now churned with quiet rage and the unmistakable clarity of purpose. He had bided his time long enough. Now, the time had come to take back control. In the dead of night, when the world outside was still, Ethan slipped into the company's network. With a quiet keystroke, he began rewriting the security protocols. The old firewalls, designed to keep others out, were now turned against the very systems they had once protected. Every line of code, every algorithm felt like an act of vengeance. Small, subtle, yet dangerous. At first, it felt almost like a game. The adrenaline surged as he executed his plan, watching the network slowly bend to his will. He could feel the power shift, the control slipping from Sophia's grasp as her once ironclad defenses weakened under his influence. For the first time in years, Ethan smiled. It was exhilarating, almost poetic, to watch her empire, built on deceit, begin to crumble before his eyes. Sophia's first sign of panic came hours later, a faint tremor in the system, barely noticeable at first. Her surveillance flagged an anomaly in the security logs, an unauthorized alteration to the firewall. She quickly traced it to a secure terminal, but by the time she reached it, Ethan had covered his tracks. He knew she would act fast. Sophia always did when her power was threatened. Ethan didn't fear her retaliation. He was ready. The chaos was just beginning, and he reveled in the control slowly returning to his hands. Every failed attempt to reassert her dominance only solidified his growing confidence. He was no longer the passive observer. Now he was the force behind the storm, and Sophia's once impenetrable fortress was starting to crack. Her systems faltered, her grip on the company slipping, and for the first time in years, Ethan could hear the sound of her frustration reverberating through the network. The battle for control had only just begun. Ethan's strategy was never about brute force. He had learned long ago that the best way to win a battle was to manipulate the environment in his favor, bit by bit. He was patient, methodical, like a chess master, positioning his pieces for a checkmate no one saw coming. Every move was calculated. Each change he made in the system was subtle, nearly undetectable, but powerful in its impact. Slowly, he began to rewrite, not just the company's code, but its very foundation, placing his influence in places where Sophia had once stood unchallenged. It wasn't just about the systems. Ethan knew that control of the company's board was the key to his ultimate victory. So he started small. Conversations with sympathetic board members, casual mentions of the direction the company could go if it embraced change. With time, those whispers grew louder, and the board began to question Sophia's leadership. Her grip on their loyalty had weakened, and soon they were reaching out to Ethan, seeking his expertise. his guidance. They were desperate, desperate for someone who could bring the company back from the brink, and Ethan was ready to step in. Sophia, meanwhile, was frantic. She had called in the best experts, her most trusted allies, but nothing seemed to work. Security firms tried to trace the breaches in the system, but Ethan had covered his tracks too well. Lawyers were brought in to investigate what seemed like corporate sabotage, but they could find no evidence of foul play. Every time they thought they had cornered him, Ethan slid through their fingers like water. His calmness unnerved them, his precision, his quiet confidence. It was as if he had already won. Sophia tried everything she could, from threats to manipulations, but nothing worked. Her empire was slipping away, and she had no control over how fast it was happening. The board's desperation turned into calls for action. They began reaching out to Ethan more frequently, seeking his advice, begging him to help them salvage what was left of the company. He was more than happy to oblige. As his influence over the board grew, Sophia was increasingly isolated. The media caught wind of the internal struggles within the company, and soon, headlines began to paint a picture of Sophia's failure. Stock prices plummeted, companies pulled out of contracts, clients withdrew their investments. The public fallout had begun, and the press gleefully documented every misstep. Sophia's reputation, once untouchable, was now in tatters. Every failed move she made, every attempt to recover, only served to highlight her growing weakness. And as the company crumbled under the weight of her mistakes, Ethan watched from the sidelines, calculating his next move. He had been patient, but now it was time to seize what was rightfully his. It was late when Sophia showed up at Ethan's door. Her once imposing figure was now smaller, more fragile. Her eyes, once filled with unshakable confidence, were now haunted, as if she could see the empire she had built slipping from her grasp. She had come alone. No bodyguards, no allies, just her, desperate and broken. The doorbell rang, and Ethan's heart rate didn't skip a beat. He knew this moment was inevitable. He opened the door, and Sophia stood there, her face drawn with exhaustion, her power once so palpable, now reduced to nothing more than a shadow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken words of betrayal, of lost trust. Sophia's voice cracked as she spoke. "We need to fix this, Ethan. You have to stop. The company—" She trailed off, looking past him as if she expected something to change in the room. Ethan didn't flinch. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. "Fix this?" he repeated coolly, his voice almost detached. "Sophia, you've had every chance to fix this. You had everything, and you threw it all away. Now you come to me hoping I'll clean up the mess you created?" She clenched her fists, but her voice was no longer the commanding tone of a CEO. It was a plea. "I didn't want it to end like this. You know, I never meant for it to go this far." Ethan closed the door behind them, standing taller, his presence suddenly imposing. "But you did, didn't you? You betrayed me, took everything I worked for, erased me from our creation. This isn't about the company anymore. It's about something much deeper, something more personal. This is about control." Sophia's eyes widened as she took a step back, her breath hitching. For the first time, she saw it, what Ethan had become. He wasn't just reclaiming his company, he was reclaiming his life. The realization hit her like a slap across the face. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a corporate battle. This was a war. And it had never been about the company. It had always been about him, about her betrayal, and about his need to take back everything she had stolen. "You think you can just erase me?" Ethan continued, his voice low and steady. "You think you can take what's mine and walk away without consequences?" Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't try to stop them. She understood now. The magnitude of what was happening, the depth of Ethan's rage, his methodical revenge. It wasn't just business, it was personal. Ethan smiled coldly, savoring the moment. "No, Sophia, you didn't just lose the company, you lost me, and now I'm going to make sure you never forget that." Sophia's world unraveled quickly after that night. The first cracks appeared in the media, subtle at first, then growing louder by the hour. News outlets that had once hailed her as a visionary now gleefully dissected her every move. The headlines screamed her failure, the fall of a titan, how Sophia's empire crumbled, betrayed from within, the scandal that took down a CEO. The articles were damning, recounting every misstep, every questionable decision, and above all, her estrangement from Ethan. It didn't take long before whispers of her betrayal spread like wildfire, and former allies, those who had once been her inner circle, began to turn against her. Former partners who had once sworn loyalty to her were now speaking out, sharing their stories of being pushed aside, manipulated, or ignored. Her trusted lieutenants, people she had mentored, now stood with Ethan, or worse, in public silence, letting the media expose her dark secrets. The pressure mounted, and Sophia found herself locked in an invisible cage. Every attempt to salvage her reputation only dug her deeper into a hole. The more she tried to explain herself, the more she looked desperate. It was no longer about what she had done. It was about what she had lost, the trust of her colleagues, the loyalty of her partners, and the faith of the public. As the media continued to gnaw at her reputation, Ethan was busy taking control of the assets he knew were essential to their creation. The patents, the lifeblood of the company, were now in his hands. He had methodically acquired them one by one, securing the technology that had once been the cornerstone of their empire. It wasn't enough for him to reclaim the company. He wanted to build something new, something better. Every acquisition, every strategic partnership he formed further cemented his rise. Sophia's public humiliation reached new heights when her once stronghold in the business world began to crumble. Social media influencers who had once celebrated her success now called for accountability, denouncing her for what they saw as greed and betrayal. Her every public appearance became an exercise in damage control, with each failed attempt to repair the wreckage only highlighting her vulnerability. She couldn't escape the storm, and every camera flash felt like a dagger to her once immaculate image. But the true blow came from within the company she had fought so hard to protect. The board, once her loyal supporters, had seen the writing on the wall. They had watched as her influence waned, as investors pulled out, and as the company's value plummeted. But now, they could no longer ignore the truth. Sophia's leadership was no longer viable. The very people she had once trusted, the ones who had promised to stand by her, were now the ones who turned their backs. In an emergency board meeting, votes were cast. One by one, the board members sided with Ethan, their fears of further collapse outweighing any loyalty they had once held for Sophia. They voted to oust her. She was stripped of her position, her titles, her control over the company. The vote was unanimous. The woman who had once stood at the top of the business world now found herself with nothing. The decision was swift, cold, and final. Sophia's termination was announced to the media with all the grace of a press release. Board of Directors appoints new leadership after Sophia's removal. The words echoed through the press, cementing the finality of her downfall. As the public watched, Ethan stepped into the role of CEO, the calm, collected face of a new beginning. Sophia had fought tooth and nail for everything she had, her success, her empire, her identity. And now, in a matter of days, it had all come crashing down. She had underestimated Ethan. Where she had once seen a partner, she had failed to see the hunger in his eyes, the coldness in his heart. Now, as she stood alone, her empire in ruins, Sophia realized too late that her fight wasn't just for control, it was for survival. And she had lost. As the media feasted on her downfall, Ethan's rise became inevitable. He was no longer just the man who had been betrayed. He was the man who had taken back everything, piece by piece, and was now poised to build something far greater than she had ever imagined. The public shifted its attention, eager to see what would come next from the man who had outplayed her at every turn. And as Sophia disappeared from the public eye, Ethan's ascent began in earnest. The game had changed, and Sophia was no longer a player. In the weeks following her removal, Sophia had nowhere left to turn. The last threads of her empire were slipping away, and in her desperation, she reached out to Ethan one final time. It was an email sent in the dead of night, subject line, "Let's talk." Her message was long, pleading, a last-ditch effort to salvage anything from the wreckage of her life. She asked for a meeting, promising to cooperate, to step aside, to allow him to take over fully if only he would help her. She was willing to give him whatever he wanted: control, shares, apologies, for one last chance to rebuild. She could not lose everything. Ethan read the email in the quiet of his office. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the weight of the years pressing on his shoulders. Every part of him wanted to reject her, to ignore her pleas, but instead, he typed a simple response. "There is nothing left for you, Sophia. You lost everything. You betrayed me, and now you have no power." He hit send and felt nothing. Her fate had been sealed long ago. Sophia didn't respond. The silence was deafening, but it told her everything she needed to know. Ethan was done with her. She had lost not just the company, but him. Everything she had built, everything she had manipulated was gone. She had no leverage left, no allies, no redemption. It wasn't just the loss of the company, or her reputation, or her former allies. It was the loss of trust, the one thing she couldn't fix. She had betrayed Ethan, and in doing so, had betrayed herself. She finally understood the depth of her mistake. Everything had crumbled beneath the weight of her ambition. As Ethan sat back in his chair, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Sophia's empire was no more. Her downfall had been swift, precise, and utterly deserved. And in the ashes of her failure, his own venture, Sync Forge, was rising. He glanced at the news feed. Sync Forge had officially launched its first product, a revolutionary technology that outpaced everything Sophia had ever developed. The media was ablaze with excitement. Investors flocked to him, eager to be part of the success he was building. What had been Sophia's empire was now his. Ethan stood at the helm of Sync Forge, watching as his new company exploded into success. What had once been a dream was now a thriving reality. His venture took over where Sophia's had failed. Innovative technology, visionary leadership, and a trust he had rebuilt from the ground up. The product launches were met with overwhelming praise, and the board, his board, was unified, loyal, and driven by a shared vision. He had cultivated something entirely his own, something that would last. Meanwhile, Sophia retreated further into the shadows. The world had no use for the woman who had once held so much power. Media outlets stopped mentioning her, investors moved on, and her name became a whispered memory in boardrooms where she had once commanded the room. Her fall from grace was complete. Stripped of power, reputation, and influence, she was a ghost of her former self, a cautionary tale whispered among those who had once admired her. As Ethan watched his new empire grow, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led him here. Every betrayal, every challenge had shaped him into the man who stood before this new creation. He had been broken by Sophia's actions, but he had rebuilt himself. And now, as he looked at the success of Sync Forge, he knew he had turned her fall into the foundation of his rise. The game had changed, and he had won.